November in Chicago doesn't arrive so much as it invades. It comes in off the lake with its collar turned up and its hands already in your pockets, and by the time you notice it, you're already cold. I'd been cold for weeks, the kind of cold that lives in the joints, in the knuckles, in the back of the neck, where the draft gets under your collar no matter how you button it. I was sitting in my office at the 2nd District going through a stack of reports that didn't want reading, wearing that charcoal wool coat Eleanor gave me 3 winters ago, before things between us went quiet and stiff. I still wore it every day. I don't know what that says about me. Probably nothing good. My hands were doing that thing they do when the pressure climbs, that low tremor barely visible like a compass needle trying to find true north. I pressed them flat on the desk and waited for something to happen. Something always happened. The phone rang at 6:43 in the morning, which is the hour when nothing good ever calls. I know because I'd been awake since 4, which is the hour when the silence of an empty apartment gets loud enough to hear. Pryor was on the line before I finished saying my name. He had that particular flatness in his voice he reserved for the ones that didn't add up. Not excited, not upset, just level and careful, like a man walking across ice. He said they'd pulled a body from the Chicago River at the Kinzie Street Bridge. Male, middle-aged, dressed well enough for a Tuesday. No obvious marks. No identification at first look. But the responding officer had found something in the coat pockets, and Pryor said it twice to make sure I heard it. Maps. Lots of them. Folded tight and stuffed in like a man who'd been in a hurry, or like a man who'd been put there by someone else's hurry. I put on my hat and went. The Kinzie Street Bridge in November looked like a smear of charcoal across the river. The Chicago River itself was the color of old pewter, flat and indifferent, carrying whatever the city fed it without complaint. A small crowd of uniforms stood near the east embankment, and a canvas had been thrown over the body until I got there. Pryor was standing with his hands in his pockets, watching the water like it owed him an explanation. I came up beside him, and he nodded once. We pulled the canvas back together. The man was somewhere around 50, heavy through the shoulders, dark wool suit, expensive cut, soaked black and clinging. His face was turned slightly left, eyes half open, the expression not quite peaceful and not quite troubled. The kind of face a man makes when something surprises him at the very end. There was river weed across his chest. His shoes were good leather, both still laced. His hands were open at his sides, palms up. I crouched down and looked at them, the hands of a careful man. Doc Healy arrived 20 minutes after me, which meant he'd had time for coffee and I hadn't. He was a compact, efficient man who treated corpses with a kind of professional courtesy I'd always respected. He got down on one knee without complaint, opened his bag, and went to work while Pryor and I stood back and let him think out loud. The first thing he said, almost to himself, was that the lungs were wrong. He pressed 2 fingers along the side of the man's throat, checked the color of the nail beds, looked at the eyes. He said it again, louder this time so we'd hear it properly. No water in the lungs. The man had not drowned. He was dead before he went into the river. Someone had put him there after the fact, which meant the river was a message or a convenience, and in my experience those 2 things are rarely the same. Pryor wrote it down without being asked. I stood there with my hands pressed against my thighs, feeling that tremor, watching the river run south like it had somewhere better to be. The maps were the thing. I counted 11 of them once we had the body laid out at the morgue and the pockets properly emptied. Folded in the standard cartographic fashion, creased sharp, the paper good quality, not your department store variety. They'd been waterproof to some degree, oilskin treated, Pryor thought, which was why they'd survived the river. I spread them carefully on the examination table while Doc Healy worked behind me. They all showed Chicago. Streets, blocks, alleys, the grid as exact and deliberate as any survey map I'd ever seen. But the streets had no names I recognized, not a single one. Different names entirely, foreign-sounding in some cases, invented-sounding in others. The scale was consistent. The draftsmanship was meticulous. The compass rose on each map was hand-drawn, precise, the needle always pointing. I checked it twice, not north, slightly east of north, just a few degrees off, but consistent. Every single one. I stood there with the fluorescent morgue light buzzing overhead and looked at 11 maps of a city that didn't exist, and felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise one by one. The dead man was Commander Elliot Marsh, retired United States Navy, formerly attached to the Hydrographic Office in Washington. Pryor ran the name through naval records while I went to find who'd last seen Marsh alive. His landlady was a Mrs. Dombrowski on North Dearborn, a sturdy Polish woman in her 60s who wore her grief the way some women wear jewelry, prominently and with intention. She had been worried since Monday. She said Marsh was a quiet tenant, punctual with rent, polite at breakfast, never had visitors except once about 3 weeks ago, a younger man she hadn't liked the look of. She described him. Narrow-faced, well-dressed, carrying a leather satchel. She said Marsh had seemed agitated after the visit, distracted at supper, and had taken to working late into the night at his desk. She showed me the room. There was a drafting table by the window, a rack of cartographic instruments, parallel rules, dividers, a brass compass, and the faint chemical smell of India ink. The desk itself was cleared. Everything useful already gone. Pryor met me outside Mrs. Dombrowski's with his notebook open and his expression closed. Marsh had been discharged from the Navy in 1944, not honorably. There had been a court-martial. The records were partially sealed, which in my experience meant embarrassing rather than treasonous. Something about falsified survey data on navigational charts submitted to the Pacific Fleet. Ships had used those charts. Nothing had sunk, but the potential had been there, and the Navy took potential seriously when it came to running aground. Marsh had paid fines, lost his commission, and come back to Chicago, where he'd apparently spent the last 3 years doing freelance drafting work for architecture firms and quietly drinking himself backward through whatever reputation he had left. I thought about that. A man trained to make accurate maps, disgraced for making inaccurate ones, and now 11 maps of streets that didn't exist, tucked in his pockets, carried down to the river. Either Marsh had kept working or someone had stuffed those maps on him after. Either way, the maps had a purpose. Maps always have a purpose. That's the only reason to make them. I found the architecture firm Marsh had done work for, Carlisle and Webb on Michigan Avenue, and spoke to a senior draftsman named Kowalski, who remembered Marsh with the measured sympathy of a man who understood professional failure from a safe distance. Marsh had worked there for about 18 months, decent enough with technical drawings, not brilliant, always precise. He'd left the firm around September, abruptly, without explanation. Kowalski said the last project Marsh had worked on was a survey commission, not from the firm itself, but a private client who'd routed the work through them. The commission was for detailed street-level mapping of specific Chicago neighborhoods, the South Side mostly, old blocks near the river, the Stockyards district, the industrial corridor along Wabash. Kowalski pulled the original client brief without much trouble. The name on the brief meant nothing to me then. It would mean something later. I copied it into my notebook and shook Kowalski's hand and went back out into the wind. Michigan Avenue in November is a lesson in what open space costs you. Dead ends have a particular texture. They're not loud. They don't announce themselves. They just quietly reveal themselves as walls you've been walking toward the whole time. The name on the client brief, a Raymond Calvert, didn't exist in any city directory I could find. No business license, no property records, no draft registration, which in 1947 still meant something. Either the name was clean enough to be real and I was looking in the wrong place, or it was manufactured, which meant someone had been careful. I spent the better part of Wednesday at City Hall going through property filings and commission records, sitting in rooms that smelled of old paper and radiator heat, with my coat on because the heat in that building was more aspiration than fact. Pryor was running down the naval contacts trying to find anyone who'd known Marsh in his service years. The map sat on my desk back at the 2nd District under a glass weight, 11 versions of a city that didn't exist, and I kept coming back to the same thought. Someone had wanted those specific neighborhoods mapped, and then someone had wanted the man who mapped them dead. Pryor turned up a name from Marsh's Navy years, a former enlisted man named Vince Tarbell who'd served under Marsh before the court-martial and had given testimony during the proceedings. Tarbell was in Chicago now, working the docks on the North Branch. We found him at a tavern on Goose Island called the Anchor, where the light was bad and the clientele preferred it that way. Tarbell was a weathered 40, suspicious by reflex, but not hostile. He warmed up slightly when I told him Marsh was dead. Not pleasantly. The old grievance kind of warm. He said Marsh had been contacted about 6 weeks ago by a man looking to hire a cartographer who could work quietly and didn't much care about the official record. Tarbell hadn't liked the sound of it when Marsh mentioned it. He'd told Marsh to walk away. Marsh had needed the money. Tarbell shook his head slowly over his beer, the way men do when they've been right about something and gotten no satisfaction from it whatsoever. He said the man who'd hired Marsh had been very specific. He wanted maps that showed how the blocks would look after the buildings came down. I drove back along the river thinking about that. The neighborhoods Marsh had been mapping, the South Side Industrial Corridor, the old Wabash District. I knew those streets, not well, but enough. They were the kind of blocks that the city had been circling for years, the kind that showed up in aldermanic backroom conversations about redevelopment, urban renewal, the new language of post-war progress that meant somebody was going to get bought out cheap and somebody else was going to build something profitable on the cleared ground. The maps of streets that didn't exist weren't historical. They were speculative. Someone was mapping what would be there after the current streets were gone. Marsh wasn't documenting the city as it was. He was drafting the city as someone intended it to become. I pulled over on the Michigan Avenue Bridge and sat there with the engine running, looking at the river running dark below. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create detailed before and after cartography of a major land acquisition scheme, and then they'd killed the man who made the maps and thrown him in the river he'd been documenting. The client name, Raymond Calvert, was a shell. I knew it once Pryor found the trail underneath it. The actual entity behind the commission was a real estate investment group called the Meridian Civic Development Corporation, incorporated in Illinois in 1946, post-war capital behind a respectable-looking front. 2 principals named in the filing, a property attorney named Gerald Scheck and a retired city alderman named Thomas Doran, 15th Ward, retired 1945. Doran I knew by reputation. The kind of alderman who'd spent 30 years learning which levers to pull in City Hall and then spent his retirement pulling the private ones. He had an office on LaSalle Street, which was either brave or contemptuous, and in Doran's case I suspected both. The connection clarified as I read the Meridian filings. Meridian had filed preliminary land survey requests for 6 city blocks in the South Side Corridor, the exact blocks Marsh had been mapping. The requests were dated 2 weeks before Marsh's body went into the river. Someone had gotten the maps and then decided the map maker was a liability. That calculation is as old as cartography itself. Pryor and I went to see Gerald Scheck first because attorneys talk more carefully than aldermen, and careful talk still tells you things. Scheck had offices on the 14th floor of the Continental Illinois building, the kind of address designed to make you feel provincial before you sit down. He was a trim man in his late 40s, silver-templed, unhurried. He knew Marsh was dead. He'd read it in the papers. He was sorry to hear it. He acknowledged the Meridian connection without enthusiasm and without retreat. The mapping commission had been legitimate, he said, private survey work for development planning. Marsh had delivered the first phase of maps and then become, he chose his words carefully, unreliable. He'd asked for more money. He'd made threats. What kind of threats? I asked. Scheck looked at me with the expression of a man deciding which truth to offer. He said Marsh had claimed the development plan required the demolition of occupied residential buildings, that tenants would be displaced, that the city filings didn't disclose the residential presence accurately. He paused. I waited. He said Marsh had been going to take his concerns to the Tribune. The residential presence. That was the phrase Scheck had used, and it was doing a lot of work. I went down to the city assessor's records that afternoon and pulled every filing on those 6 Southside blocks. On paper, the corridor looked near industrial. Warehouses, a defunct cold storage facility, some light manufacturing. But assessor's records and reality have a complicated relationship in this city, and I'd learned long ago to visit a thing before I trusted the paper version of it. I drove out there in the early evening when the light was coming down hard and sideways and the street lamps were just starting to take. 3 of the 6 blocks had people in them, not many. Old single-room dwellings tucked behind warehouse facades, the kind of accommodation that happens when housing is short and enforcement is flexible and the men who own the buildings don't particularly care how the books describe them. Working men, mostly. A few families. None of them with leases that would survive a demolition permit. Marsh had discovered that. And then Marsh had done something I hadn't expected from a disgraced cartographer with a drinking problem. He decided it mattered. Reconstruction is the part of detective work that nobody photographs. There's no body anymore, no crime scene, just the shape of events that you assemble slowly from what people let slip and what the evidence insists upon. Here's what I believed happened. Marsh delivered his maps and then discovered, maybe by revisiting the neighborhoods, maybe by asking the wrong question of the right person, that the blocks he'd charted had residents not declared in the filings. He confronted Meridian. Scheck or Doran or someone who worked for them told him to be quiet and paid him to be quiet. Marsh took the money and wasn't quiet. He copied the maps. He was going to the Tribune. The meeting with the narrow-faced visitor at Mrs. Dombrowski's boarding house 3 weeks before his death, that was a final warning. Marsh had kept the maps on him after that, maybe thinking they were insurance, maybe thinking if something happened to him they'd be found and tell the story. He was right about that last part. He was wrong about the insurance. Someone with access to Doran's resources and patience had waited for the right night and taken Marsh cleanly. No water in his lungs, a professional errand, not a passionate one. I went to Thomas Doran's office on LaSalle Street, and he was the most comfortable guilty man I'd ever sat across from. Not comfortable like innocent, comfortable like insulated. He was 70, heavier than he should have been, well-tailored, behind a desk that had seen 30 years of exactly this kind of conversation. He admitted knowing Marsh, denied the threat, denied any instruction given to any person regarding Marsh's continued health. He had 3 lawyers present for the interview without my asking. That told me something. He was a man who'd been preparing for this conversation and had decided what shape it would take. He was cordial and specific and completely unhelpful. At one point he leaned forward and said he was sorry about the whole business, and his eyes were the color of old concrete and just as warm. When I stood to leave, he said that redevelopment was a difficult and complicated public good, that Chicago had always required hard choices, and that the men who made those choices had always borne unfair scrutiny. He said it like a man reading from a document he'd written for himself long ago. I thanked him for his time and walked out into the cold. The narrow-faced man from Mrs. Dombrowski's description was found through Tarbell, who knew the name from the docks. A fixer named Carl Rubin, not unknown to the 2nd District, nothing that had ever stuck. Pryor and I brought him in for questioning on Thursday morning. Rubin was the kind of man who dressed well and smelled of aftershave and looked like he'd been taught to behave by someone who'd also been taught. He admitted nothing directly. He was very good at it. But there was a moment, maybe 15 minutes in, when Pryor showed him one of Marsh's maps and asked him what he knew about streets that didn't exist. And Rubin went very still in a way that a man only does when something specific lands in front of him. His hands flattened on the table. His eyes went quiet. It lasted 2 seconds, and then he was fluent again, relaxed, cooperative in the useless way of men who've been questioned before. But I'd seen it. That 2-second window. Pryor had seen it too. We let him go because we had to, because what we had wouldn't carry in a courtroom. But I knew the shape of it now. I knew who'd carried the instruction and who'd carried it out. It closed the way too many cases close in this city, not with justice so much as with paperwork and the particular disappointment of what the law can actually carry. Doran was insulated by money and lawyers and 40 years of knowing where to stand. Reuben had nothing on him that would hold. But Scheck made a mistake. Men like Scheck always believe the record will protect them right up until it doesn't. He'd filed the original cartographic commission under the shell name, yes, but he'd paid Marsh by check, directly, from a Meridian operating account with a memo line that read, Survey Services Phase 2. And Phase 2 had been delivered 4 days before Marsh went into the river. The payment established the relationship, and the timing closed a door on Scheck's alibi narrative. We arrested Scheck on Thursday evening for conspiracy in connection with Marsh's death. He would eventually serve 4 years. Reuben was never charged. Doran died in 1951 of a comfortable heart attack in his comfortable home on the North Shore. The 6 blocks were eventually developed in 1949, the residents displaced as planned. Chicago is very good at doing the same thing twice. I went back to the South Side blocks the following Saturday. I don't know why. It's a thing I do sometimes. Return to the geography of a case once it's closed, as though the place has something left to say. The blocks were quiet in the gray November morning, smoke from the dwellings behind the warehouses, a dog in one of the alleys, a woman hanging laundry from a second-floor window, the kind of optimism that November never discourages in some people. I thought about Marsh, a man who'd spent his life making accurate records of the world and had falsified them once professionally and catastrophically, and then at the end had refused to falsify them again, had chosen accuracy at the cost of his life. There's something in that. I'm not sure it redeems the first failure. I'm not sure redemption works that way on the ledger system, one act balancing another. But it was there, and I noted it. I stood on the corner of a block that would be gone in 2 years and thought about a disgraced man who decided the truth mattered, and about all the people who would lose their homes because it hadn't mattered enough. I filed the Marsh case report on Monday, 40 pages, which was more than I usually gave them. I described the maps in detail because they deserved the description. I logged every piece of evidence, the maps, the drafting instruments recovered from Mrs. Dombrowski's, the Meridian filings, Scheck's payment records. Pryor signed as witness. Vasquez reviewed it in his office and said I'd done thorough work. He said it with the careful tone of a man who knew thorough work had, in this case, produced a limited result. I told him it was Chicago. He told me he knew that. We looked at each other for a moment with the shared understanding of 2 men who have spent their careers watching the city eat the people who trusted and continue to do their jobs anyway, because the alternative is worse. Eleanor had called that morning from her sister's place where she'd been since March. She'd asked how I was. I'd said fine. She'd said I didn't sound fine. I'd said it was a complicated case. She'd said they always were, Jack, and there'd been something in her voice that was neither accusation nor forgiveness, but somewhere in the territory between them that I hadn't found a name for yet. Before I closed the file, I logged the last item. Marsh's brass compass, recovered from his inside breast pocket, still working after the river. I set it on the desk beside the case folder to write the description. Standard naval officer's compass, brass casing, beveled glass face, gimbal-mounted needle, functional. I started to write. The needle moved, not the small drift of a compass settling, a slow, deliberate swing, away from north. I looked at it. I looked at the window. Nothing out there but the night street, the amber lamp on the corner, the November dark. The needle tracked something, steady, patient, following a course along the window. I held absolutely still. My hands were doing that thing they do, but I pressed them flat and waited. The needle moved as far as the northwest pane and stopped. I watched it for a long time. Then I closed the case file, and the needle swung back to north and stayed. I told myself it was the metal in the desk, the building's infrastructure, any one of 100 rational explanations that a man with 40 years on the job ought to be able to reach for easily. I wrote, compass, brass, functional, one item, logging complete. I put my coat on. I turned off the lamp. I didn't look at the compass again. Some directions I've learned you're better off not following.